We're here today talking with Doug from Comic World in Manitoba, Canada. Doug, tell me where and when you were born.
Born July 28th, 1956. So that's 57 today.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So, when do you remember some of the first comics that you ever bought as a kid or read?
Yeah, well, I got into comics actually probably because I was watching TV cartoons and stuff like Wonderful World Disney, things like that. The earliest one I can remember having was probably Comics and Stories from, I'd say maybe 1964. First comic my dad bought me that I can recall. I think it had, Donald had some kind of a Greek outfit on or something. It's kind of interesting. So, but no, I liked all those science fiction and cartoon kind of shows back then, and that kind of led to the comic thing.
So, just because you were a younger age at that time, the funny animals, Disney would have been more of interest.
Yeah.
And then eventually grew older. Did you get into superheroes like everyone else?
Well, it started. Yeah, I would say it started with the cartoons. So I liked the Harvey and the Disney and pretty much all those funny things. And I didn't have too many to begin with because I was still watching the TV cartoons more. And then stuff like the Superman TV series from the 50s would come on in reruns, so that got me all interested. And I liked all those goofy, big, lumbering monster movies,
Mm-hmm.
We didn't get the really good ones like Gorgo and Congo and Godzilla. It was all these, giant ants and all this kind of stuff. So got into that. Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, all those kind of shows.
Yeah.
So and then we had to kind of spill over into comics.
So how did it come that you landed up eventually trading or buying and selling comics?
Well, it started with, I think the Batman TV series is what really got me all hyped up about comics. Yeah, I think I bought my first one probably when the show came out, which it was at 66, I think. So I got my first comic off the stands, and my dad says, well, did you know there's secondhand stores? And I says, nope, didn't even know what that meant, eh? Because I was like, I guess 10. So we went to this little place on Osborne Street in Winnipeg. It might have been 100 square feet, little secondhand bookstore. And it had like 20 comics to pick from. But one of them was one of my most treasured comics as a kid, which was 80-page Giant, number 5, the all Batman Giant issue.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of what started it.
So at that time, a typical used bookstore with just a few comics
Yeah.
in the corner kind of thing.
Yeah.
And okay. And so was there anywhere else you could buy comics at that time? Could you go to every newsstand, all the confectionaries?
Yeah, we went mostly to the drugstores. Pembina Pharmacy was one we went to all the time. I think I started when we were on Marshall Bay in Fort Garry when I was a kid, and then we moved to Fort Richmond. So it was actually a trip for me to go get comics because there was nothing local. I actually have to take a bus ride to go get them. Save up the allowance, go get a couple of comics from the store.
Right.
So,
do you remember how much your allowance was?
I think it started out like 50 cents. Then it ended up $1, and I got so motivated by comics I would just start doing chores and mowing the lawn,
Right.
doing the snow and anything I could do. And then I started doing it for the neighbors because I was even more motivated. So,
Do you remember any of the first titles that you had to get every month, every new issue?
Yeah, well, actually, I for about a year I bought new comics. Then I discovered more and more of these secondhand bookstores where I could get twice as many comics for the same dollar, right? Of course, it meant a bus ride, or actually, at first my father would drive me across town to these secondhand bookstores, eh? And one of the popular ones in Winnipeg was called Harold Snell's. I can't remember the store, but he was on Princess Street. So he was like this ex-dancer that became a bookstore owner. And then there was a few of them on Selkirk Avenue. A lot of us went to Mickey B. Klevinsky's, Selkirk Book Exchange, places like that. And that's when we started collectors started meeting each other in these secondhand stores, all competing for the same handful of comics. You know, the comics in the 60s were much harder to get than they are today, you know, 40 and 50 years later, because there was not a lot of places to find a back issue comic back then, eh?
Right.
So,
Did you ever go to garage sales or anything in those days?
Garage sales,
Flea markets, did they have them?
they didn't have much of that in Winnipeg. Actually, we were among the first to have them, and my mom started that. She started what they called basement sales, I think mid-60s or so. So she held a couple basement sales and did amazingly well because there was no other ones at that time anyway. And she actually got the idea because we used to go to Grand Forks all the time. Grand Forks would have all kinds of sales and like big little books and things you just didn't see where we were.
Right.
So that's where we got that idea. And that actually led to me putting a little table out in the street, on the street corner, and trading comics with the neighbor kids. And I used to trade 2 for 1. So that was how it kind of started, eh? And I guess, I don't know, by 1968 I probably had about 10,000 comics, which is quite the accumulation for a 12-year-old kid.
Right.
So.
And at that time, did you have was there any knowledge of older comics were worth real money at that time?
Yeah, I think about 1967 or so is when I started ordering catalogs out of the comics, like Robert Bell, Rogovsky, those people who had those little lists in there, and I would order stuff off them. The one story that comes to mind early on was I'd order I think it was a Spider-Man 9 or something from Howard Rogovsky there. And back in those days, condition wasn't important. It either had a cover or it didn't have a cover, you know, and it was complete or incomplete, and that was about it, eh? So I ordered, I think it was a Spider-Man 9, and of course he was sold out, because that's the one I wanted, Electro or whatever. And so he just chose whatever alternative he felt like sending me, and he sent this Hulk #6. And back then, in his catalog, he would say, tape was not considered a defect. So he sent me this Hulk #6 that had about 20 pieces of Scotch tape on the cover from left to right across the cover, all yellowing and disgusting. So that was one of the first mail orders I had ever done. Didn't stop me though.
Yeah. What would you have paid for that Spider-Man #9?
I think it was like 25 or 30 cents or something. No, it was not a lot of money, eh?
And did that include shipping?
Shipping wasn't very much. I think I ordered like 5 books and the shipping might have been 10 cents or something. So it was not much in those days, eh?
And did you have, when you were doing your trading here locally in Manitoba, did the other kids also buy older comics that you actually amassed?
Yeah,
I
would buy and sell with the other kids, but actually comics that were even 5 years old were hard to come by at that point in time. So it's, I would be buying Spider-Man number 75 or something on the newsstand, and you'd find one in the 30s, and that was exciting. Yeah. So it was not easy to get back issues in those days, eh? Even at these second-hand stores, there was so many kids looking for back issues then, you couldn't find much there. So what I did is I actually got it in my little head that maybe if I helped these store owners out a little bit and washed the counter and cleaned up a few things and did that little chores for them, they would give me a little bit of favoritism, and of course that worked. So it encouraged me to do it even more, eh? Yeah. So after a while I ended up getting first pick on a lot of these things, eh? So one of the more exciting things that happened, I think it was that Mickey B. Klavinsky's there. He came up with a Spider-Man 1 once, I think it was 1968 or 9. And he wanted $5 for it, which is a huge amount of money for me back in those days, eh? But he actually let me work it off, so that was the days. Even then I was a little bit worried about condition, and I guess a lot of people just weren't in those days. They just wanted to read the comics, which is, I guess, the purpose, eh? Right. But he used to like to clip the corners off the bottom right and write the price of the comic there. So I talked him out of that. So instead he would write the price on the cover in the little Marvel box at the upper left. So you see comics all over Winnipeg with, 7 and 10, 15 cents written on the cover up there.
So when he was asking $5 at that time, what would his been like his reasoning for the price? Is because it was a number one? Did he know that this comic
Yeah,
had
he was
value?
starting to know because he kind of became the place to go for the scarcer comics. And he was the first one to actually charge more than cover price for a back issue comic. Whereas most of the other prices were half price or slightly more for a used comic. So he was pretty much the first one that got into the collectible comics.
And you think he did that because he knew that the market actually really was growing financially for back issues, or was he just a greedy bookseller?
No, I think it's because there was so much competition for the same books that he realized there's something going on here. Maybe these are actually collectible. And then there'd be the odd article. There was, I remember Captain George articles that used to be in the 60s newspapers, and people would read those and they'd talk between themselves. And then one day people started talking about the Rocket Splash comic collector. So I got my first issue way back, I think it was maybe 1968 or so. And that's
And
why
how did you obtain that? Is that just through mail order?
actually they had ads actually in a couple of comics, which I guess was pretty expensive for them at the time, but I never noticed that till later. I'd actually found out from another comic collector I met in the secondhand stores. So I finally got his subscription, and then I was already selling back issues. Well, I actually was selling back issues starting around 1971, but locally I had been doing it for a couple of years already. So I had these regular customers coming over all the time already,
Right.
even as a kid.
So let's put the late 60s into perspective. You're still not even in high school yet.
Yeah.
You got over 10,000 comics.
Yeah.
So tell me about the breakdown of your collection there by the late 60s.
Well, in Winnipeg it was tough to get stuff even 5 years old. So most of what I had was what the kids had bought and read and were trading off to me, 2 for 1 on the street corner there or in my basement. And I would get, well, of course, when they gave up their collections, sometimes they'd sell me a whole box for like $1. So I'd end up with little boxes from kids who quit collecting and things like that. And I was a weird little kid who wanted comics, so everybody was coming to me.
How did your family, parents think about it?
Well, they encouraged it because actually I was this short little kid in school that everybody picked on, which I guess happens to a lot of people in those days, And that's kind of another thing that steered me into the comics, into a little different world there, So now I'm glad for it. In those days it didn't seem quite as good when you're a little kid being picked on. So, and I knew a couple other people who are like that too, so. And they would go into it, but then they don't regret it at all once they've got into the world of comics. And I certainly don't. So.
Do you remember there being certain titles that it's like, oh, I hope I'm going to find a certain title in the box, or I hope I don't find that title. I don't want any more of those.
Yeah, well, actually, I guess at first I wanted the kids' comics when I was a little younger. Then I got into the DCs because of both the Superman and Batman TV shows. And then I discovered Marvel. And I started reading a few Spider-Mans. And the one I really remember being my absolute favorite was number 33. The one with him under that giant machine, and he's lifting this enormous thing. And he has to get out so he can go save Aunt May from Dr. Octopus. And that got me hooked on Marvel, that book, which I'd got as a back issue for either trading or one of these second-hand stores, So,
did you notice a vibe between people who at that time were trading with you and reading comics that Marvel was it?
Marvel, when I was younger, it was actually the other comics, the DC and the cartoon, but by the late 60s it really turned towards Marvel. Between the group that I was hanging out with and at all these stores. Of course, anybody always liked a 10-cent book anytime you could find one. There just was not a lot, even in those days, So, anytime we found a 10-cent book, it was considered a treasure. So, and then, I was going to get back to Rocket Splash. We were talking about, one of my friends has suggested I get this magazine, and that's kind of when I tapped into this different world that there was a whole world of collectors out there, and it had been going on since the early 60s. And that's when I discovered, oh, I can buy back issues even better than from the prices at Robert Bell and Howard Rugofsky and these type of people. So I started ordering out of the Rockets Blast, eh? So what had happened there is that I'd met, by coincidence, there was another guy a little older than me. His name was Joe Krolick. He was in Winnipeg. I guess I'm not sure how old he is, about 5 years older than me maybe. And he was already selling the Rockets Blast, so that's how we connected, because I saw his ad, eh? So I went and bought comics from him. And then of course he had to come and see what I had. And he sweet talked me into basically cherry picking my collection. So I ended up selling all my best stuff for what turned out to be a really low price. But you know, he didn't know in those days because there was no guide. And it sounded good because you always wanted more comics for more money for more comics, eh? So I tried to sell my duplicates, and he ended up getting a lot of my best books in those days. That's the way it was, eh? But
What would you have considered your best books at that time?
oh, I had some Golden Age. I had a few, you know, like World's Finest and Wonder Womans and Batmans from the Golden Age. Probably not very good condition by today's standards, but back then there's just things you didn't find around the Winnipeg area. Golden Age were just not common in Winnipeg. A lot of the Golden Age of those DC heroes especially were the Canadian editions that were usually really beat up. And usually what you found was like Dells and old classics and stuff like that, eh? But like to find a Golden Age superhero was something else in those days, eh?
How were you able to convince all the kids that them trading the 2-for-1 was a good deal for them?
Because I had thousands for them to pick from. And of course I would keep my own collection, and they'd only get to look at the duplicates, eh? So they'd have their 6 books to trade or 10 books to trade, and I'd have 1,000 to pick from. So the 2-for-1 deal seemed pretty good. But if they wanted to trade like their Porky Pigs for my Spider-Mans, well, that didn't work. So they might have to give me, you know, a stack of Porky Pigs to get one Spider-Man. So that's how that kind of thing worked.
So you already did have an idea that some titles were...
Yeah, a little better than others,
yeah.
eh? But the eye-opener was when I went through the Rockets Blast, and you know, we're talking a 100-page magazine, and half of it was ads with prices of everything. So that was my original price guide, is what people were asking in the Rockets Blast. So that helped me price actually things, and I was getting 50 cents and $1 for comics, which doesn't sound much today because that's what's the new comic, $4 these days. Back in the late 60s, 50 cents and $1 seemed like a lot of money for a comic. The Spider-Man #1 was in the stratosphere at $5. So, but...
and so why were you willing to pay that $5?
Oh, because that's the book I wanted the most, was Spider-Man #1, eh? Didn't even realize it was an Amazing Fantasy 15 at that point in time, eh? Right. So, and then I started reading the Buyer's Guide, and then I realized, okay, that's why I like these Disney books so much. There's a guy named Carl Barks that wrote a lot of these stories that were so good, and back then he was just a good artist. They didn't know who he was, or because there was no credits in these things, eh? But a couple of the people had written articles, and I found, oh, his name is Carl Barks. Well, I want more of these. So that was my quest to, which was my favorite comic of all time, is the Scrooge and Donald Ducks by Barks. My quest is to get every Barks comic ever made. Took me about 7 years, and I think I got about 6 books away. So it was some of those giveaways that was pretty tough in those years, eh? And a couple of our gangs were pretty tough too. So it took about 6-7 years to get my Barks sets. But the Buyer's Guide came along later in the 70s, but the Rockets Blast pretty much ruled mail order comic world for about a decade, or probably a little more.
So what year did you place your first ad?
My first ad was in Rockets Blast. Had a Hawkman cover. I think it might have been number 72 or so. Be around 1971. So that was, as far as I can remember, my first published ad. And then I would make catalogs, and anytime someone ordered something, I would send the catalog along with the comic, and they would pass the catalogs into their friend, and somebody would order. And
So when you did your first early catalogs, how did you decide you were going to price your books?
What I did is I just looked at the prices other people were asking in the Rocket Splash.
And did
that
you
was,
match them, undercut
yeah,
them?
yeah. It would depend on the book because, see, condition was not important in those days. Basically, if it, like I said, if it had a cover or if it didn't have a cover, it was kind of the distinguishing mark. I remember an early catalog. It might have been either Robert Bell or Rogovsky, I guess. But they had like a Captain America one with a cover for like $20 and coverless for like I think $15. It wasn't much difference.
Right.
So, but it just wasn't that important yet, eh? So
By the time you placed that first ad in 1971, do you think you already had the first Overstreet guide?
no, I didn't. No, I don't think. I got the first Overstreet guide by reading the ad in Rocket Splash, and by the time I got around to getting it in, I already had several ads and catalogs out. My first catalog that I mailed out rather than published in a magazine was, I called myself KK Comics. King Comics, I think it went, or something like that. I can't remember exactly. So I made a few catalogs under that name, and then I came up with Comic World and Doug Sulipa's Comic World, and that was it. Eventually, what I need in my store. So.
And so tell me kind of the steps that you made towards getting your store first opened.
Well, we had this community of collectors basically traded between each other, trying to get their issues, you know. Then I met some of the regulars that became my best customer in my store later on. One of them being George Bedelli, who actually is the Manitoba collection, had all the high-grade books from out here. And then I met, I don't know how many, probably about a dozen major collectors. We always interacted. And then this place called the Autumn Stone opened up. And it was basically a record store. And they had a little bit of marijuana type paraphernalia and stuff like that in there. And in the very back of the store, they had a little leather shop where they make leather jackets and whatever else, hats or whatever you wanted. Eh? And one of the guys there was also kind of into comics. What was his name? Frank McNichol. He called himself Frank McTruck. And Stu Nichols, I believe. And they started this little comic thing. And they were pretty much the first one to order new comics and hold them for collectors in Winnipeg. I figured that was an amazing idea.
What year was that?
That was probably around 1971 too, I guess. So they had that little shop at the back of that Autumn Stone store for 2-3 years. And they were ordering from Canadian News, which is the local ID or independent distributor. And you could actually subscribe to things through them.
So they were just buying like out of the newsstand comics, and instead of returning them, they were just
they would just hang them out there. Of course, they were heavy on the titles that were considered collectible at the time, and they would skip the other titles. But you know, like Conan was a big thing. In the early '70s, there was a really big deal that Kirby went from Marvel to DC. So the New Gods and all those titles were huge. Conan, when it initially came out, was actually not that popular. It took about a year before it started to catch on. And then all of a sudden people were paying $2 for this book, #1 Conan, when it was about a year old, which seemed like a huge price increase. That's when people started to buy duplicates of things.
Do you feel that, you said they didn't speculate on Conan #1?
No, because actually I remember buying Conan #1 and I'm looking at it on the newsstand, and basically it looked like a Native American or a caveman or something on the cover with this spear, So I didn't even bother to read it. I have no idea what it was about, didn't care. All I knew was it was a #1 and I was going to buy it, But,
when do you think the whole idea started with the completists of I must own every Marvel comic?
Yeah, well, that probably started even in the '60s, but it took a little while to catch on in Winnipeg. When we actually had a destination to go to, which was the Autumn Stone store, that's when people started talking about it and getting each other hyped up about it. So the idea of having a mail or a subscription service for new comics so you wouldn't miss things was a real big deal for all of us back then, eh? And
So-
they would order, like from Canadian News, who gave 30% off. They would actually give, if you bought enough comics, they give you 10% off cover, which is something we never had a choice of until that point in time. So I would end up buying 5 and 10 copies of a lot of number ones back then, eh? I guess I was kind of a mini dealer back then already, eh?
Right.
Even though I was just a kid, basically.
So you remember some of the titles, earliest ones that you kind of speculated on?
Oh, I bought multiple copies of Amazing Adventures 1, Astonishing Tales 1, and Green Lantern, Green Arrow came out. Nobody really cared at the time. That kind of caught on later. It seems like a big deal now, but back then, it just kind of went past us all, eh?
So did the idea of the number one issue already have extra merit?
Oh, everybody wanted number ones, eh? Yeah, we always paid more for number ones. So, and all the secondhand stores got that clue in by the early '70s, and even the secondhand bookstores that didn't usually charge at more than half price, they already had collector's sections, and of course they had no idea what was good and what wasn't. So they would have some stuff way overpriced and other stuff way underpriced, and the best thing to do with them was to trade your junk off, and they didn't know the difference. So, I might take something that was unpopular at the time, like Thor was not very popular, for example, in the early '70s. So I'd take off my Thors and trade for Spider-Mans, for example, eh? And then I'd take the Spider-Mans and swap with the buddies I had that were in the collecting hobby. So.
And at that time, were you still personally reading a lot of
Oh,
comics?
I was fanatical. I read everything pretty much, eh? Marvel, DC, the Disney, which I was still heavy into. Then I started even buying fanzines, because then through Rocket Splash, you discovered all these things. That's when I discovered more about the Golden Age, so I'd buy, the reprints of the Golden Age stuff. And, I never knew anything about Prince Valiant or Flash Gordon or any of that stuff until that point. And then the whole world opened up because of the Rocket Splash for me and a lot of collectors, I would say.
So when you first were able to mail order from other people, what were sort of the first things that you would have gone, oh my gosh, I'm so excited to finally be able to get that?
Oh, for sure. Well, you know how tastes change. One week I'd be really, 1 month I'd be really heavy into, say, Legion of the Superheroes comics. And I'd want to fill in all those numbers of adventures. Another week I would say, well, I've got most of the Spider-Mans from, 35 to 75, so I need about 10 numbers, so I have to get those numbers. So those were worth sending away with. So that was actually very exciting.
So in the early 70s, now you're middle of high school, what would the size of your collection be, and how many comics were in your personal collection?
Probably about half of them were in my personal collection, and the other ones were duplicates that I would, trade or sell or whatever. And I think at the height of my collection, I probably had about 50,000 comics in my collection by the late 80s. But yeah, I was reading pretty much everything in sight those days. I was, along with everybody else, excited about, the Kirby thing and Conan when it took off, and it really took off. Everybody had to have Conan for that short period of time there, eh? And every time a number one came back, and then all of a sudden Tomb of Dracula is out, and when they hadn't had vampires for years, and Werewolf was back, because that was, Comics Code had basically stopped all those titles for many years. But if they were allowed to come back now if it was kind of in the classical sense, which is why they made Tomb of Dracula the way they did, eh? And like horror comics were gone for years, so we didn't see EC comics. I didn't know what an EC comic was, probably till about the early 70s, eh? So, yeah, we were all buying, basically, the world was kind of centered around new comics for our group, or newer comic stuff in that 5-year period, until we, like I say, we got into the mail order and discovered all this stuff and all these articles and realizing what's out there, eh?
Was there ever any type of comic convention in the 60s or early 70s in your area?
Not really. And I think the first major conventions that they weren't major. Major meant like 100 people. first conventions that I really went to were more in Minnesota, Minneapolis, around there. And those are very exciting days, eh? So, but that was a little after, by the time I had opened my store, that I was starting to make trips I remember going to Maryland and New York and California and all these places when I was barely out of high school, eh? So, yeah.
So you placed your first ad in Overstreet Price Guide Annual number 2 in 1972.
Yeah.
So at that time you're still 15.
Yeah.
And do you remember, did you get much response from that?
Oh, for sure.
What was the next step in your...
Yeah, well, that's when I realized how powerful the mail order catalogs were. So I made more and better ones all the time. I didn't even know how to type yet, so here my mom's typing this catalog for me. She's getting all excited that these things are selling, and what happened is I guess it was 1971. After she'd seen me selling comics since, I don't know, 4 or 5 years like this out of the basement, all of a sudden this collection came up from a fellow named Jerry Martell. He was in the opposite end of town. I don't even remember what part of Winnipeg, but I went down there and I think he had about 5,000 comics, and there must have been probably 500 comics from the 50s and probably 500 Golden Age in that collection. And I'm looking at this collection, and his price was $200, which was a heck of a lot of money for, in 1971, I guess I was, 15 years old? Mm-hmm. So I actually talked my parents into borrowing me $200 based on what I'd been doing, and they actually did it. So that's when I really got heavy into doing these ads in the Rocket Blast, and it got busier and busier. So, and I was buying more comics, and I started advertising in the paper, which is one of the best ways to buy collections back then, to put an ad in the paper to buy back issue comics. That actually worked for a good solid decade. It's amazing what I came up with out of Winnipeg collections, eh?
Do you feel it was because of a collection like that in a sense made your career?
That collection was probably one of the biggest catalysts of me going full time, because then I realized how much money I made from that. I would say probably made about $2,000 or $3,000 in the first 6 to 8 months on that collection, and I got to keep a lot of prime stuff in my own collection yet on top of it. That was always kind of a battle, is trying not to keep all the best pieces when you're trying to get the money back out of a collection. So that's a battle that went on for many years. I think with a lot of people who are collector dealers, eh? If you take all the best stuff out, well, that's actually what pays for the collection, eh? So it was always a battle trying to decide, okay, I'm going to keep this and I'm going to sell that one to get some of the money back, eh? But I had my money back to my parents, I think, probably within the first month or two. So that got them excited about it, and they were willing to help, eh?
So tell me now, so the Overstreet Price Guide is now coming out annually. Do you remember kind of early on what effect did that have on the industry and pricing?
Well, at first people they didn't know what to make of it. Is this a good guide or is it not a good guide? And what is mint and what isn't mint? Because the condition really wasn't very well understood in those days. I think the first guide, they had 2 conditions, good and mint. Basically that's how the market was. And good, by today's standards, was probably fair or worse. Maybe half the cover gone or back cover off or something. Basically good meant you could read it. And mint meant was kind of anything very, very good or better. I'm sure Overstreet didn't think of it that way because he was in the market for longer, but that was kind of how it was around our area.
So when everybody's selling and this new price guide comes out and it's like, oh, all the books have gone up this year. Oh, and they went up again the next year. Mm-hmm. Did you feel already this urge that I can actually ask more again because it's going up anyway? Or was it, no, let's just cash in the money quick because it's good right now?
Well, that's actually kind of when I kind of decided what is it that people want, and I have to have that. If I want to actually do this as a business, I have to have the stuff people are asking for and not just the leftovers from collections. So I'd actually go out and buy stuff even at full tilt often and then raise the price. And that was not a concept a lot of people believed in that days, but if I was the only person in Winnipeg to have these back issues, people would come to me. So that's kind of what eventually led to me having a store.
And what year did you open the store?
It's actually February 1972. I was still in grade 12, 17 years old, and it would be after school. So school would end at, I don't know, 3:30 or 4 or whatever it was, and I'd be opening from, say, 5 till 9 in the evening. So on Carlton Street, some little second floor. Actually, it was a converted house, and it was basically a bedroom that was converted into a little store. It was like, I think it was about 120 square feet, that store. So I was there for a couple of years,
What would you have paid for rent?
I don't even know if it was $100 a month. It might have been less than $100 a month. So.
And was the business good from the start, or it took a while to...
Well, I actually knew enough people to get word of mouth around that I think I probably had an initial customer base, maybe 50 customers, I would say. And almost from day one, the Marvels would be selling, say, 20 to 50 copies per issue, which is better than any store in town. So I would go to Canadian News, I would go right to the source. There was a fellow down there, his name was Red, was his nickname. I don't even know what his real name is, but we always called him Red. So he would hold all the new comics for me. I get the lists out of the comic reader. I'd say, this is what's coming, this is how many copies I want, and I got first pick because I didn't return them. So he loved the fact that I wasn't going to return them, because in those days returns were anywhere from 25 to 75%.
Right.
So, and I said, you know what, you sell them to me and you give me first pick and I won't return them. I just loved that. So all of a sudden I was his favorite customer. So I would get these comics. I would pick them up the day they were out, and I'd have them out even before the stores had them out. And people would be there, I think which was Thursdays, I believe, was the day new comics came out. And I'd be customers waiting at the door when I'd be coming home from school. I'd be opening up and there'd be a couple of customers. I was on the second floor, so there'd be customers lined up down the stairs waiting for me to bring the new comic shipment in,
So how was that? Because you mentioned there was another store selling comics also. That they were
The
getting from
Autumn
them.
Stone, yeah, the Autumn Stone was doing that also. I decided the thing that they were missing was back issues. I had actually taken some of my back issues and put them in their store on consignment. So I took my back issues out of there, put them in my own store so they didn't have any back issues again. And I decided, okay, I'm not going to order select titles, I'm going to order everything. I carried everything, even if it was an Archie or a Love comic. I said, I'm getting every comic. So that was kind of how I started that. And of course, there's people who like that. Didn't sell many Love comics, of course, but I had them.
And you were making enough money at that time to float that you could carry all these back issues that didn't sell?
I did, and at that time, of course, we didn't have to discount anything because there was no competition. And a lot of customers would buy everything, so they say, if it's a Marvel, I'll buy it. People like my friend George Bidelli, which I've known since about 1971, he was instantly my best customer. He would buy, say, about 5 of each of everything that came out from Marvel and DC. Number ones, he'd buy 10 or 20 copies or more, and that was pretty much from day one. And other people would buy multiples of number ones from day one. So it was, even though it was an early thing in those days, I think by 1976, my first really big sale was Spectacular Spider-Man number 1. I'd ordered 3,000 copies, which is probably 2/3 of the copies that the entire city of Winnipeg got. And I ended up having 3,000 copies that you couldn't find in most of the newsstands because I had them all. And people were buying like 50 and 100 copies at a time of things then. So yeah, it grew really, it ballooned really fast. And that little 120 square foot store didn't last very long. So I ended up moving to Donald Street, which is, I think it was maybe about 400 square foot store, which is still not that big. I was there for about 3-4 years, eh?
When did you move there?
I would say that would be about 1976. Lasted about 3 years. And that was on the second floor also because rent was cheap. Had a lot more space, there was better parking, kind of accessible to everything. So it was called the Phoenix Building on Donald Street. So
Tell me about some of your success stories, say mid-70s books that you speculated on. That
well,
really went crazy
pretty much
for.
by then everybody had Marvel fever. The DCs were popular too, but let's face it, Marvel was the mania by then. Number ones everybody bought in quantities, so some of them I bought too many copies, but that's how you live and learn. So actually I would buy so stuff like Tarzan #1 would come out and I'd order like 1,000 copies, and sometimes they would all sell out and sometimes I would have half of them left over, so made some mistakes like that. Had too many copies. Other stuff was a big success, like the Spectacular Spider-Man 1. Out of the 3,000 copies, I think I had about 300 left by the end of the month. Between all the collectors who were buying multiple copies, eh?
So in the 70s, was there ever the idea of, this is a hot comic, so you're instantly marking it up? Or
That happened.
Sell cover until it's gone?
By the time #2 was out, I already had #1 out for double cover price. And you just kind of made up prices then, because the guide, although there was a guide, it was kind of irrelevant on cheap end stuff. And especially there was not a lot of competition. So you would just kind of make automatic prices, like #1s were usually double, and other issues usually about half more than cover after they're a month or two old, eh? So just the fact that I had all these back issues was very exciting to a lot of collectors, eh? You would come in, let's say you had decided to, I want the 1974 Khazars. It was like, 20 issue series? Well, I'd have all 20 issues in the back issue bin there. So all you had to do is flip through the bin, boom, there they were. They were waiting for you, which is something you never saw in Winnipeg. It just didn't exist at that time. When I opened the store, everybody thought it was crazy. How could you possibly make money on comics? But it was actually amazingly busy. And then add that onto the fact that I was still making mail order catalogs, which nobody else was doing either. So they just thought I was a strange little kid, and what is he doing? So I was getting a lot of newspaper articles and interviews and all this stuff, like, here's this weird little kid downtown in this second floor of this building, and he's got lineups out the door of people trying to buy these comics. What's that all about?
When did bagging and boarding start for you?
Actually, myself, I did the bagging and boarding as early as the early 70s, because I had dealt with Robert Bell, and he was the original guy that supplied bags to everybody. Of course, those were polyethylene bags, the ones that all go cloudy and smelly after a few years, but hey, it was something. I know a lot of people would use stuff like saran wraps and baggies and stuff like that. But if you bought it new, if you actually were a collector, you tried to protect it. You didn't know how to protect it, but you tried it. And I think by 74 already, I was already ordering the bags in quantity from Robert Bell, and I would be selling in my store, and of course encourage all the customers to buy them, eh? And every back issue I had a bag on it, so no boards yet. And I think we started the boards probably a couple of years later, eh?
So what about Treasury comics?
Oh, I love those. As soon as I saw them, I figured those are exciting. I ordered big quantities in the mall. I think the first one that I bought in quantity was the Captain Marvel Shazam #1, the C21. The C20 never reached Winnipeg, the Rudolph one. But the C21 Shazam, I think I probably bought 300 copies. I still have about 50 of them because they slowed down fast enough. Yeah, that was another title. It was very exciting at the time. This is pre my store though. I bought them from Autumn Stone yet, but when Shazam #1 came back, that was a big deal for everybody who knew anything about back issue comics, because Captain Marvel had been gone for what, over a decade, I guess. And so his big comeback was a big deal. And actually that was the book that I ended up meeting this fellow named Joe Congrishan. I was this, I don't know, 15-year-old kid, and he was like, I don't know, 35, 40 years old. And this is before I had a car. He drove me all over town and helped me find these back issues, and we did a lot of things together like that. So
at this time you're so busy carrying all the new comics every week, so how much of an impact was older golden and silver comics for you?
well, they took a while to take off because people didn't realize they had to pay more money for back issues for a while. But then I think by the mid-70s it really started to take off, and back issues were starting to rival new comic sales for me in Winnipeg, because I was the place to go. You can go to the second-hand stores and have 20 books to pick from, or you can go to my store and I'd have like 10,000 back issues out in the store, on top of every new comic that was released. And by the mid-70s I was also going as far as to order stuff from Bud Plant, who was a wholesaler. So I would start getting in the fanzines and the portfolios and anything that was interesting, basically. I carried the Robert E. Howard hardcovers from Grant, and anything that was related.
Did you ever have any issues with your regular distributor, that there were certain books they just didn't get?
Well, Canadian News was actually very good for me for all those years. I bought from them till about 77, and this red fellow was in charge, and like I said, I was his favorite customers, because there was times I would buy, half the print run that they had received for the entire city of Winnipeg. So in fact, there was the odd one where I bought the entire print run. First one I remember buying the entire print run was or that he received, was Howard the Duck, because Howard the Duck, everybody anticipated as being the biggest book of the year.
Why was that?
Well, they had read the, I guess, the giant-sized Man-Things with the Brunner Howard the Duck backup stories, and there was that little Fear appearance, which really didn't make much of an impact. But I think the giant-sized Man-Thing stories, which were really beautiful by Brunner, got everybody all excited, and it was probably the most anticipated book of the late 70s. I had bought 5,000 copies. I remember hearing that Robert Crestall and the gang out east there, they basically bought out the entire east coast of Howard the Duck. And basically you couldn't buy Howard the Duck #1 in the newsstands in many parts of Canada because of us dealers who were all buying them for their rabid, back issue, or their comic collectors,
So when you would buy from Canadian News, did you know in advance how many copies they were actually getting?
Well, they would tell me, like, he would say, okay, we're going to get 5,000 or 5,200 copies. Is how many do you want? If it was the one that I needed a big quantity. Normally I would just have a list saying how many I wanted of everything.
Could they control how many they brought in, or were they just?
They didn't seem to have much control, but I think after a while they realized that Winnipeg was a good city for superhero books, especially Marvel, and DC was the second best, so the quantities seemed to have gone up. So they actually got pretty good quantities and all that. But when you needed something that was a little more obscure, like let's say you want to get a bunch of extra copies of a Gold Key, that would be a little rougher sometimes.
And so the whole time were you carrying all the Gold Key, all the Charlton?
I pretty much carried everything that was a comic. Even if it didn't sell, I would only order, say, 2 copies, just to say I had everything. So I was pretty much the only person I ever knew who did that. And my buddy George Bedelli, he had to have one of everything, at least sold one. So if it was a Charlton Love comic, he would buy it just to have one.
And so someone like him, would he's buying this massive collection he's building quickly. At that time, even to him, how important was him keeping the condition going?
He was the most fanatical conditioned person I had ever met in my entire comic career.
So he would flip through them all, pick the best
one? He would basically the procedure is I'd get there at about 3:30 or 4 in the afternoon on the Thursday, I think it was. And he would leave work early to be there at the door waiting for when they came out. And he would go through every book. If I had 3,000 copies of Spectacular Spider-Man #1, he would go through all 3,000 copies to pick his 100 copies, the 100 best. So on a big shipment day, we'd often be there from say 3:30 till like 2:30 in the morning for him to pick his copies. But he was dropping, $200, $500 sometimes in a week in the 70s, which was a heck of a lot of money in those days.
How is he funding his collection?
Well, he ended up with something like 50 to 100,000 collection or comics in his collection like he had collected it as early as the 60s, but he really didn't go gung-ho until I opened my store. He had started buying larger quantities at Autumnstone, and by the time I opened my store in 74, and he had so much to pick from, that got him excited. So I think probably for a 10-year period he bought big quantities of everything. He ended up having, I would say, probably 75,000 comics. Average one by today's grading standards is probably about a 9.2. The reason they were not higher is that in the 1970s, a mint comic was not one that had stress-free like it is today. That whole thing changed when CGC came along. In the old days, and actually even into the 80s and maybe even the early 90s, a mint comic was one that had no factory flaws, was perfectly aligned, had square corners. That was what a mint comic was. Stress marks meant nothing. You could have a big kink in the spine, it could still be a mint comic as far as we were concerned. And that's basically how George picked his stuff. He would flip through the pages even inside, check the centerfold, see if that has a tiny little tear, was a little bit off center, he didn't want that one. A big deal for many, many years was, how the spine would tilt forward or backward and wouldn't be perfectly aligned. You'd like to say have a white line on the front. People hated that in those days. Those would be the hardest copies to sell. Stress-free, ding-free didn't matter in those days. That was not a mint comic. That was the biggest change in grading over the years. And a lot of people who bought their comics in the 70s, 80s figuring they had mint comics are shocked to see many years later that even though they bagged and boarded these comics when they bought them new, that they're not, it might not even be 9.0s or 9.4s because they weren't looking for stress-free copies. So that was probably the biggest radical change in the grading of comics, and that occurred around when CGC started, around, what was that, 98 to 2000, somewhere around there.
Yeah. So how do you find throughout the 70s, how did the whole view on comics as an investment look, especially with people kind of starting to hoard newer comics?
Well, everybody figured they were going to get rich in comics, let's face it. That's what the 70s was about. That's why there's people figured Bronze Age comics were never going to be worth anything, and they used to say that. In fact, I think there was a disclaimer in Overstreet, I can't remember what it said, for a few years that basically the gist of the disclaimer in the Overstreet is that Bronze Age comics are common and high grade. Well, that's why it didn't say probably not going to be worth anything, but it was basically saying they're common and high grade, and were not considered that great investments for a long time. They didn't realize that the grading standard would change so much and be so strict as it is today. And people are amazed that Bronze Age comics are worth so much money now. The same thing is starting to happen to the Copper Age comics, and now even the modern comics. People don't realize how uncommon Copper Age comics are in strict near mint because they don't understand how CGC has changed the grading. A lot of people just are back to the, if I bought it new, it's mint. And that's how a lot of people still think. That's why you run into a lot of problems even on eBay. Grading is just not good with a lot of people who haven't studied it closely enough.
Do you find that you have a special tie to the Bronze Age, being the decade that you really established
Yeah,
your
well,
business?
I think I really do like the Bronze Age the best because that was the most exciting period as a dealer for me. Seeing all this stuff out, you know, getting big quantities, having people wait out the door, you know, doubling and tripling and quadrupling your money within a week of the day the thing came out, eh?
Right.
Like people had, I remember Howard the Duck #1s were $5 and $10 within a month of the day it came out. Robert Crestel, I remember I think he had it for $20 or $25 a month later because he basically bought out the East Coast and you had to buy them from him if you wanted one, eh? So that was the way it was, eh?
Did that happen very often?
Yeah, it didn't happen as often as people were hoping. They bought all these big quantities of things and let's say I would buy Tarzan #1, I'd put it for 50 or 75 cents in the back issue bin. It never seemed to go up in the guide, so that was a little bit discouraging for people. That's when I think maybe it might have encouraged people to buy more back issues. That's when I was starting to get more into back issues too, because I was doing so well with them in my mail order catalogs. So I think it was around 1980 or late 70s. By that time I almost had 1 million comics. I had them in storage units and the storage vaults, and I'd rented a house to put them in, and I had them all over the place. Eh? But a lot of it was actually newer comics in quantities, so it wasn't as good as it sounded. So then I eventually had to get rid of a lot of those quantities and try to turn it into better stock. Eh? So I had a lot of clearance sales, but I remember some very busy weekends. Once a year I'd have a clearance sale day where I'd make up bargain sets so you'd put the whole, say Tarzan 1 to 28 in the bag and put it out for like $10 or something. I remember one time having about 200 people in line for that, and I think the busiest one-day sale I ever had might have been brought in, I don't know, $5,000 or $6,000, and around 1980. That's quite a bit of money back in those days, eh?
So when you're it's the late 70s now, you're 20 years old. Do you know at that point this is what you're doing the rest of your life?
Well, actually, I think I knew that by 1975, because I had actually done my grade 12 in 1974, in the first half of 74, and by the late 74 I was already at university. And I did 1 year at university at Commerce, taking Commerce. And by the end of that 1 year I was so busy with the comics I just really didn't have time just for school. And I had mail order catalogs and stores and phones ringing off the wall and people selling collections, and I was so busy I could hardly handle it. What am I wasting my time going to school for, eh? So that decision was made about a year after I opened the store, basically.
And did you have this vision of, it's good to have back issues, I don't mind if this book's going to be here the next 20 years because it's probably going up in value,
Yeah.
its rarity is going to grow?
Well, I discovered something that probably other people didn't, and maybe to this day they don't get, is that if it's rare in any condition and it's hard to get, and even if it's not popular, someone's going to want it, especially by mail order. I guess that's where they lose the vision. If you're stay stuck in one city like Winnipeg and you don't really do mail order, you don't understand the concept of why would somebody want, Little Lulu #96. It's only a cartoon comic. Why would someone want that? People didn't realize there's comic collectors out there who really admired Marge's Little Lulu and had to have the whole set. And Fox and Crow was one of my favorites, for example. Well, why would you want Fox and Crow? It's just junky cartoon comics. That's how people thought, eh? It's not a Marvel, so it can't be a good comic. So that's, by the late 70s, I had actually printed a statement in one of my catalogs saying that that's where I thought the future of comics was going to be, is things that were rare in any condition, rather than popular things that everybody wanted. So that's kind of where I made that change, is in the late 70s. I decided I'm going to carry everything in back issues. I had to have all the gold keys, I had to have all the Dells I can get my hands on, all the Harveys, all the Archies, all the everything. And I think that's the reason I'm still around today.